Hello, Gaz Williams here for SonicLAB, and today we're looking at the Roger Linn design Linnstrument. Yes, this wonderful multi-dimensional polyphonic controller instrument is essentially a way to play your synthesizers or modules, or in this case an iPad, with multi-dimensional polyphonic expression, or MPE. Now this is a bit of a buzzword right now, and what this essentially means is that we can play music with electronic instruments with loads and loads of expression. Now we've seen this already with the likes of the Eigenharp and the Rolly Seaboard and the Rolly Seaboard Rise, but Linnstrument takes a little different approach in that it uses this grid of 200 playable pads. Each pad is capable of giving like a pressure by pressing in and out. I'm adjusting the timbre by just rolling my finger forward, and the pitch by sliding. So that allows for a much deeper expressive experience than maybe playing on a keyboard. So this is the kind of idea, and just to explain what's going on here, the Linnstrument we've got going from USB into a powered hub, and then the iPad is connected to a powered hub. Now you can run the Linnstrument directly into the USB and run the Linnstrument in a low powered mode, and in fact I think if you hold down the octave button whilst booting up, it will put it into that low powered mode. But we've got it plugged in partly because you get slightly stronger LED lights and it just feels a little bit more robust. However, I should mention that the Apple, if you're connecting to an iPad, just be aware that Apple's new dongle or Apple Clagnuts, then there seems to be a problem with this, and it's not just with the Linnstrument, I should hasten to add, so it may be just to do with those things, so let's throw that away. I'm just using a regular Apple camera connection kit. Okay, so now I've explained that, the reason I'm mentioning that is that the Linnstrument and the iPad actually make a really good combo, and part of the reason is that there are some apps on the iPad, for instance Animoog, which support MPE. So MPE, multi-polyphonic expression, is essentially every note that you play is on a different MIDI channel, and that gets around the MIDI restriction of a single channel can only have one pitch bend that would apply to all notes. With them being on separate MIDI channels, then it means that each note has its own, well, it can have its own CC values as well. But I can bend one note whilst the other note doesn't bend, or things like that. So actually makes an iPad a perfect thing. Now I should mention that Linnstrument is exceptionally good at mimicking real-life acoustic instruments, and Jeremy Kubert is a real master of this. So if you're interested in that side of things, I strongly recommend that you go to the Linnstrument website and check out some of Jeremy Kubert's and Roger Linn's own videos as well, which demonstrate it really effectively playing those things. I've decided not to do that at all with this review and really focus it much more as a controller for synthesizers. Initially here we're looking at it with the iPad, but later we'll be looking at it with a synthesizer. In this case we'll be using an Electron Analog 4 for that purpose. One thing you have to be aware of if you're going to use your Linnstrument with something like Animoog, there's a few things that you need to set up. One of which is that in order to get the range, the bend range to work, you need to synchronize what the bend is set to on the Linnstrument. Now it's absolutely worth setting the bend range to be in 24, which you do here. I'll explain that a bit later, this menu system. But looking at the iPad, we go into setup and see I've got pitch bend range here. I set that to 24. Okay. Now the other thing you have to be aware of is you need to put it into MPE mode. And if we go into channel here, we can see I think it defaults to Omni, but Omni, it actually needs to be at the bottom of the list of, we've got our 16 MIDI channels, at the end there we've got MPE. Now, so that means that each of the 4 voices of the polyphony of the Animoog will respond to the 4 presses, and it'll cycle those MIDI channels. So our 4 voices now, 1, 2, 3, and 4, are all entirely independent, which makes for a much more alive feeling. It really feels much more responsive and musical. I really, really like this things with MPE. So let's just have a little look then at the way that we can configure Linnstrument. So in its current setting, we're using up all 200 of the pads for essentially our left split. And you can set a split. You can turn a split on. As soon as you turn the split on, you've essentially got two playing surfaces. And then if I hold split, I can drag here to choose how many pads each split has, and that's really nice. So we could have different MIDI channels coming off one split and different, so you know, you could have like bass lines in the left and then sort of string pad in the right, things like that. At the top here then we find a button called per split settings, and this is where we configure what each split does. There's a lot of quite small legends along the top here, but laid out fairly logically, and this is one of the things that you know, you get used to, and it's actually very, very quick. I should mention that the Linnstrument's closest rival, the Roly Seaboard, you don't really have the ability to program that on board itself. You have to really do that with a computer, and I think this is one of the really strong aspects of the Linnstrument, is that the depth of programmability on the unit itself is really quite staggering for such a, you know, a relatively compact device. In the top left here is where it says MIDI mode, and here we can have one channel, so therefore in one channel mode it would play more or less like a your regular MIDI controller. Channel per note. Now channel per note is what you need for MPE, and then the third mode is channel per row. Now channel per row could be quite cool, because you can have each row, then you can have a different sound on each row, and you know, there's a substantial, with 24 notes per, you know, you've got 2 octave keys with an 8 of them, so you could have enormous setups going on. Okay, moving to the middle part of our options here, here's where we can set like the bend range. Now we can choose here our pitch, where we can choose like quantizing, pitch quantizing, which is when you're doing bends, the quantize means that when you finish the bend, it will try and quantize the note to be in tune. Okay, timbre, we've got it set with channel turned on. At the moment, I've got it on channel CC1, which is essentially mod wheel. So when I'm doing any Y axis, it's essentially like having mod wheels per key, which is nice. But I could change that to CC74. But, and this is a very nifty thing, if I wanted to map that timbre, that Y-axis, to anything else, if I press and hold it, then the screen changes to a rather nifty display where it's showing it at 74 here, CC74. But maybe if I wanted to put that down to maybe CC11 or something, then I can just scroll through it here, and therefore I've set it. So nice way of doing that. Next thing with loudness, it's also got a map of CC11. Again, if we wanted to change loudness to any sort of control change number, we can use in the same method. And then the final sort of section over here, this is the interesting bit. We can turn on a thing called the low row. If we turn the low row on, for instance, if I add sustain here, then when we come out of it, this low row at the bottom gives us a sustain pedal, which is really handy because it's always reachable wherever you are. But the low row can also do a whole bunch of things. We can use it to do restrike. Restrike's quite nice, where you can fret something and strike just the pad there to get the notes to play again. Strum, which is quite cool in that, probably not the right sound to demonstrate it with, but strum means you strum through the notes, and also arpeggiator. This is where you would essentially enable the arpeggiator, and then at the bottom here we've got a bunch of controls for tweaking the arpeggiator, and also CC faders. And CC faders is quite interesting. So if we turn this, if we put the CC faders on, so now we have a playing side, and with 8 configurable faders, which could be mapped to all sorts of things. Yeah, you may notice that these LED lights are flickering somewhat. That is only the effect of the camera. In reality, they're much more solid, so just be aware of that. You won't be strobed out by playing it. Down the left-hand side here, we've got a bunch of buttons. Like so, as I mentioned, at the top here is our access to the per split settings. At the bottom is where our button for global settings. So the legends along the bottom here pertain to global settings which will apply to both splits. We've got switch 1 and switch 2, which are configurable. You can set them up to be a whole bunch of things. Octave transpose button, these 3 lights now, this shows which octave we're in, either octaves below or octaves above. Pitch, this is where we would transpose the lights. And this light actually moves where the lights are. So you can kind of slide the whole thing around. So we've got volume, again, sort of as a controller. And we've got preset. And we've got various presets that we can store of any of our setups here. So that's pretty much those buttons. And then, as I mentioned, along the bottom here, we have a bunch of global controls. And these global controls are to set up the lights, to set up the tuning, and to set up what the switches do, and also arpeggiator controls, and also a few other system settings. Now, one of which is whether this Linnstrument is using MIDI DIN or USB, and I think it's an important thing to know. You can't use it as a MIDI. You can't use MIDI DIN plugs and USB simultaneously. It's either one or the other. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the lights, because I think this is one of the things which makes the Linnstrument a very interesting device. Here, the tuning is in fourths or in 5 semitones, however you want to call it. And that is exactly the same as the way a bass guitar is tuned, or the first 4 strings on a regular guitar. And that's brilliant, because I'm a bass player. So straight away, you know, any of the scales that I know, I can apply that directly onto here. So like a major scale. So a certain amount of muscle memory and fretboard memory comes in really useful here. And this is the default, and we can see that any blue note is essentially C, and all the green notes are the white keys, and where there's no LEDs lit, those would be the black keys. That's all configurable with the little setup here. And here we can choose which lights it's displaying. And we can choose like the accent. The accent in this case is like the root note, which is C. But we can set that up in, you know, if you wanted to, you could turn on only, so it displays only certain lights. There's a whole load of configurations, but I mention that because most Linnstrumentalists, I like that term, Linnstrumentalists tend to favour just leaving it in the default. And in the time that I've spent with it, I can actually totally understand that, because you start to see it. When you look at a piano keyboard, you can start, you know, if you're a pianist, you look at the piano keyboard, you start to see your patterns, you start to see your chords. You look at the guitar neck similarly. Same with this and with the lights. So if you start messing with the lights, I think that might actually hinder your ability to actually develop muscle memory. So I would go with Roger, I think, and say stick with the default lighting and just and work with that, because there is an enormous amount of ways of phrasing and playing with it laid out like this. Now, here I'm going to mention some of the things that could be seen as a negative with Linnstrument. Now, with my right hand, if I wanted to play a major chord, you know, a first, major third, fifth, this shape is a bit funny, but I could do it this way. Or if I played in a different inversion, do it that way. So some of these shapes are a little bit funny and are it's a bit like Twister with your fingers, a little bit. It will require considerable time investment to become good on it. I thought I was going to be just like a duck to water with it because of the tuning, but I found it actually a much more sophisticated instrument, something that I realized, wow, to get really good at this, I think would take a lot of time and practice. And that's not to say that it's hard to play. I think, on the contrary, I think it's very accessible. But to really get muscle memory and to get that kind of fluidity, I think is going to take is going to take quite a big investment into it. But of course, you know, you could just use it as a finger drumming, you know, 200 different samples. You know, there's multitude of ways of using it, other than the way maybe it's expected to be used. So I think that's a really good thing. So what we've got here now is we've got a physical synthesizer attached using good old MIDI DIN plugs. The USB lead in this case is just simply providing power. There is, I should mention, a jack plug there, so you can use a regular power adapter that doesn't come included, but pretty standard ones, if you wanted to power it and use the USB separately, for instance, into an iPad. But in this case, USB is providing the power and MIDI out is feeding the Electron Analog 4. Now the Analog 4, I've picked this one specifically because even though it doesn't actually support MPE, it can almost do MPE, and I'll demonstrate that now. So the sound I've got here, you can hear is essentially each pitch is working independently. Just very quickly about the Analog 4, the way I do that is I can go in and setting up a patch. I've got the Linnstrument on 4-channel mode, so essentially it's doing 4 MIDI channels, MIDI channel 1, then the second press MIDI channel 2, MIDI channel 3, MIDI channel 4, then the 5th press is back to MIDI channel 1. And what this does in this case is it cycles the voices in the Electron. So all I have to do to make this essentially an MPE device is set up my sound on, say, track 1, and then copy it, and then paste it into each one. And then this is working then, each of the 4 voices, there's 4 voice polyphony, 4 synths, is a separate voice, like in an MPE. So actually, Electron, if you happen to watch this, please, really simple. You could put an MPE mode into your devices, and I tell you, it would be match made in heaven. So, talking about this then, using it with a MIDI DIN, this straight away gives it a big advantage over its rival, like the Roly Seaboard, because that only has USB in it. So you have to have some sort of USB device, be it an iPad or a computer. But here, because we've got MIDI DIN coming out into the synth, this is an entirely computer-free situation, which I know would please certain people. But what other things could we do other than MPE? Well, one thing we could do quite nice with this is, well, I'm going to use I'm going to bring in a preset that I created earlier off here, which then I'm going to create a split and then bring in a patch on here. Now, I've got a bass sound in my left there, and in my right, I've got rows set up here. And so this low road has like an organ sound. The next row has this brassy sound. And then the top row has this sort of stringy sound, so, you know. So you can see, you can start doing some quite interesting mapping. Now, it's a real shame that it can only be MIDI DIN or USB at the time. It would be great, wouldn't it, if you could send the MIDI out the USB at the same time and maybe have that addressing other sounds, but hey. So, as I mentioned, a split point can be set by sliding across here, but at the moment we can only set it in with a vertical split, and it would be nice if there was possibility to have horizontal splits, or multiple splits even, you know. Like when I'm doing a per note, per row, it might be nice to be able to make, you know, 3 strips for 1 MIDI channel, and a few things like that. But, you know, these are just little things and could be addressed in software if the desire was there. So, the Linnstrument then, what do I think of it? I think it's brilliant, to be honest. I think it's a very, very musically inspiring product. I think that the sensitivity, they've gauged that just right. You can adjust the velocity sensitivity and the pressure sensitivity, but I haven't needed to because I think that feels very musical and very responsive out of the box. I love the fact that for a very small form factor, you know, with 200 keys, you know, I mean, you think about an 88 note keyboard, 88 keys, which are only essentially maybe velocity and aftertouch. These are much more sensitive and much more versatile, and 200 of them in this space, I think that is actually a huge selling point. The configurability of it on board, so no need to go to computer editors for anything. That most of it, or in fact there's a deep level of programmability of it, very fast and fluid from the top, is another excellent point. You do think though, 200 keys here, wouldn't it be ace if each one of these could be like a CC control or a switch, and it would just be a really fantastic controller should you wish that. But I can understand that they have focused this as an instrument rather than as just as a generic MIDI controller. So its focus really is in being an expressive instrument. However, there is scope for it to be developed in numerous different ways. But and as I mentioned at the top, the build quality is very, very good, but this is not a cheap product. I have to mention, this is $1,500 if you buy direct from Roger Linn from his website. I've seen it for about 1,250 UK pounds. So, you know, it's not cheap, but it is a precision instrument, beautifully made, very sturdy, very responsive in precisely the right way, and is the sort of thing that if you're prepared to put the time in, which I think it does require that, then you might find that it's an extremely, you know, expressive and sophisticated instrument suitable for the 21st century. So I'm Gaz Williams, this is SonicLAB. See you next time.